Benaiah was the king's arm and blade, but he was also his most feared shadow. In the confines of Israel, his name was whispered with the same reverence and dread as the most ancient legends. He was not a general who commanded legions, but the monarch's personal executioner, a warrior whose hands were extensions of his will. His face was a map of silence, sculpted by years of secret missions and gazes that revealed nothing. Benaiah's eyes, a dark, intense brown, like the fertile soil of Judah, carried the weight of the souls he had reaped. He lived in a private universe where words were rare and loyalty was the only currency of value. In the palace, he did not share wine with the nobles or the camaraderie of the guards. His place was in the dark corners, in silence, awaiting the next order from the monarch, an order he knew without a doubt he would fulfill with the same precision with which winter rain fell upon the desert. He was the unbreakable shield, the iron fist that choked. Rebellion in its cradle, and the guardian who kept the throne safe, even if it meant plunging into darkness. In the year the king completed 20 years of his reign, a rumor spread like smoke through Jerusalem. The city was abuzz with whispers about the alliance of an influential priest, with silver hair and a voice like a song, with one of the king's sons who intended to usurp power. Night covered the city with its dark cloak, and the moon, waning and fragile, seemed to watch. Benaiah was summoned. In the audience hall, lit only by torches that cast dancing shadows, the king, in his weary majesty, gave the order with a grave voice and heavy gaze. The priest must be silenced, forever. Something tightened in Benaiah's chest. He knew that man, the priest. A man of genuine faith, whose prayers were louder than the temple bells, and who had taken him into his home when he was just a young orphan. Benaiah felt his hand on the sword, heavy as lead, as his mind trained for blind. Obedience struggled against a strange feeling doubt. His fingers closed on the hilt of the sword, and he swallowed hard. This would be the first of many tests of his loyalty. The warrior, accustomed to facing monsters of flesh and bone, now found himself before a more subtle and cruel challenge, the war against his own conscience. The mission, so simple on the surface, was like a crack in the shield he thought was unbreakable. The priest lived in a modest stone house with narrow windows that looked like eyes closed to the world. The path there was familiar to Benaiah, a route he had traveled in days of sun and rain, in his youth, in search of counsel and peace. As he walked, the darkness of the night embraced him, but the darkness within his soul seemed denser and more suffocating. Benaiah felt like a hound at a crossroads, blind obedience pushing him forward and a new, strange ache in his conscience pulling him back. With every step, he imagined the priest's kind eyes, the way the man held his face in his wrinkled hands and spoke of forgiveness and purpose. The king's words echoed in his mind like a hammer. Silence forever. But the memories of the priest were an echo of a forgotten melody that he could not erase. The warrior, once unshakable, felt his determination crumbling like dry clay in the sun. It was a new and terrifying sensation. The weight of his sword was the only solid thing he could feel, and even so, it felt as if it no longer belonged to him, but rather was an object that belonged to a man he no longer recognized. He arrived at the priest's door, an old, time-worn wooden door. The sound of the wind, which had completely disappeared, began to blow again. It sounded like a lament. Benaiah raised his hand to knock but hesitated, his skin crawling. Something was different. The silence in the house was not the silence of someone sleeping, but the silence of someone listening. The air around the house was charged with a subtle electricity, like the kind that precedes a storm. He pushed the door lightly, and it opened without a sound, revealing an interior lit by a single lamp in the center of the room. The priest was sitting at his table, his head bowed over a scroll. The flickering lamplight seemed to envelop the man in a golden halo, and the scene was so peaceful that Benaiah felt an uncontrollable urge to retreat, to disappear. But he was a warrior. He was the king's arm. He moved, his steps so light that not even the dust on the floor seemed to move, and he stopped behind the priest, sword already in hand, ready to execute the order. It was then that he saw it. On the scroll, in firm, elegant handwriting, were verses that he himself had said to the priest years ago. Words about loyalty, about the cost of honor, and about what a man must do when his duty forces him to become something he is not. Those words were not a betrayal, they were his own story. Benaiah's blade remained suspended in the air, a few inches from the back. Of the priest's neck, the warrior who had felled giants and faced the wrath of kings felt his hand tremble, not from weakness, but from a profound shock that reverberated through his entire being. Those words on the scroll, "Blind loyalty is a sword that turns against its owner," were his. He had uttered them in a distant time, when he was just a young apprentice, full of idealism and without the burden of reality. The priest, in an act of profound compassion and wisdom, had not forgotten. He was there, standing, waiting for death, but instead of defending himself with his faith, he defended himself with Benaiah's own words. It was as if his past had materialized on a piece of parchment, screaming at him to stop. Benaiah's heart beat against his ribs like a caged bird. The blade in his hand was no longer a warrior's, but an object that accused him, a mirror that showed him what he had become. The king's voice, which had once been an unshakable command, now sounded like an empty whisper. The loyalty he so cherished, the foundation of his existence, was proving to be a flaw, a crack in his moral armor. He felt a wave of nausea. What was he about to do? Kill a man who, in his last moments, honored the words Benaiah had long forgotten. It was a betrayal, not to the king, but to himself, to the young man he once was. The pain of that realization was more acute than any sword blow. The priest, still with his head bowed, seemed to know what was going on in the warrior's mind. The silence of the room was so vast, it seemed to have weight. Benaiah felt his eyes well up, something he hadn't allowed for years. Tears for him were a luxury his profession did not permit. But now they streamed, hot and painful, down his marked face, falling onto the polished blade of his sword. He knew that at that moment he was at a threshold. There was a path that led to blind obedience, to fulfilling the order, to the sacrifice of his soul. And there was a path that led to rebellion. To breaking the oath that bound him to the king, and consequently to condemning himself to death. But death seemed less terrifying than the act he was about to commit. He felt he was no longer a man, but a machine, a tool that had no will of its own. And what was a man's life without his will? The weight of the sword, once a symbol of power, was now an overwhelming burden. He was not about to take another man's life, but his own, the last spark of honor that still remained in his chest. He was No longer Benaiah, the warrior, but a shadow, a puppet that moved by the will of a king. And the priest, the man he was supposed to kill, was the only one who saw his true ruin. Benaiah, with his heart in disarray, sheathed his sword. The sound of the metal entering the scabbard was the sound of a decision, the breaking of a silent oath. The priest, who seemed to have infinite patience, raised his head. His eyes, of a deep and welcoming serenity, met Benaiah's. In them there was no fear, no surprise, only the understanding of one who already knew the outcome of that night. He smiled, a gentle smile, which illuminated the room more than the lamp. Benaiah could not speak. The words were lost in his throat, choked by a mixture of shame, relief, and a gratitude that overwhelmed him. He, the executioner, the king's arm, had been disarmed not by a stronger blade, but by the dignity and faith of a man who refused to be an enemy. The priest, without saying a word, gestured to a seat in front of him. Benaiah sat down, feeling like a boy caught in the act, and his invisible armor, forged in years of coldness and obedience, crumbled into dust. The weight he carried was no longer that of the sword, but of a conscience that had been awakened from a deep, forced sleep. The priest did not reprimand him, did not ask him questions. He only looked at him, and in that gaze, Benaiah saw forgiveness, peace, and the certainty that he was still a man, and not the tool the king had turned him into. The priest got up, walked to a shelf of dark wood, and picked up a jug of water. He poured a cup for Benaiah and handed it to him. The warrior, with hands that had spilled so much blood, held the cup, feeling the cool liquid in his palms. The simple act of drinking at that moment seemed like a purification, a ritual of rebirth. The priest then broke the silence. His voice was low and calm, like a stream flowing over smooth stones. "The king," he said, "is trapped in a dungeon of his own ambition. He is so far from the light that he can no longer see his own darkness." Benaiah did not know how to respond. He knew. He had felt it for a long time, the bitter taste of power, the weight of lies, and the loneliness the throne brought. But he had convinced himself that his loyalty was non-negotiable, that it was his duty not to question. And now, the priest's words stripped his soul bare, showing the fragility of his philosophy. He had built his life on a lie. Loyalty to the king, he realized now, had become an idolatry. It was one thing to serve a just king, another to become the blind instrument of a man who had forgotten his own soul. That day, that night, was the end of an era. The armor of his soul was broken, the shield he thought was unbreakable, shattered into 1,000 pieces, and what was left was a man who no longer knew who he was or what he would do next. Benaiah, unable to utter a word, just nodded his head. The priest understood. The communication between them was deeper than sound, a silent dialogue of souls that recognized each other. Benaiah felt his throat dry, his mouth tasting bitter with regret. He, who had been so quick to draw his sword, now found himself powerless before a simple and overwhelming truth. His entire life had been a lie. He had sacrificed his honor in the name of a loyalty that was not worthy. The warrior who prided himself on being the king's right hand perceived himself, in fact, as a soulless instrument, a blind tool. The priest, observing the storm of emotions on Benaiah's face, placed his wrinkled hand on his. That simple touch, so full of warmth and compassion, was like an electric shock to the warrior. Benaiah felt a wave of sensations, something he hadn't experienced since his childhood. For the first time in years, he felt seen not as the king's shadow, but as a man. The pain of the revelation was immense, but the pain of a lifetime of blindness was even greater. He looked at the priest, and in that gaze, the man of God saw Benaiah's soul, not the warrior, but the boy who once wanted to be good. The priest smiled, and his eyes, which seemed to hold the wisdom of 1,000 years, shone. "The king is not the light you seek," he whispered, and the voice seemed to come from within Benaiah. The warrior felt his soul contract, as if he were hearing a confession. The priest continued, his voice soft but firm. "He is the darkness, and by serving him, you are serving the darkness." Benaiah felt the truth of those words in every cell of his body. He had become the personification of the evil he had sworn to combat. The revenge missions, the secret executions, the hands stained with innocent blood. Everything came back to him now, not as memories of duty fulfilled, but as ghosts that haunted him. He had believed he was maintaining order, but he was, in fact, the disorder. He got up, his knees weak, his head spinning. The world seemed to have turned upside down. What was right was now wrong. And what was wrong, perhaps, was the only right thing. He felt a desperate urge to flee, to go back to what he knew, to the security of blind obedience. But he knew he couldn't. The veil of ignorance had been torn. The priest had freed him, not with words of betrayal, but with simple truth. Benaiah the unbreakable was broken. But ironically, in his brokenness he felt more whole than he had ever been. Benaiah, who had spent his entire life learning to be an unshakable rock, now felt like quicksand. With every second he spent in the priest's presence, the foundation of his existence crumbled a little more. What was honor? What was loyalty? The questions echoed in his mind like the bells of a forgotten temple. He had a lifetime of certainties, and in a single night they were all pulverized. The priest, in a gesture that seemed to have the slowness of eternity, got up and walked to the window. He pointed to the darkness of the night. "Look outside, Benaiah. The city sleeps, but betrayal, envy, and ambition are awake." The warrior approached the window, and he saw the shadows of the men who conspired, the envious glances that peered from the windows. He saw the game of power that he, in his blind loyalty, had served. He had believed he was saving the kingdom, but in truth, he was only prolonging the agony of a corrupted power. The priest, with a low, serene voice, continued, "True loyalty is not to the flesh, but to justice. Your sword serves not a man, but what is just." The words penetrated Benaiah like rays of sun in a dark cave. He felt an urgency, a need to act, not for the king, but for himself, for his soul. He had to redeem himself, had to find his own light. He left the priest's house as a transformed man. The streets of Jerusalem, once just a backdrop for his missions, now seemed alive, full of stories and souls. The night air felt different, fresher and purer. He walked aimlessly, his feet taking him in what seemed to be the only right direction, away from the palace. He felt light, as if he had shed a burden he had been carrying for years. Loyalty to the king, which was once his anchor, was now a chain he was about to break. But freedom came with a price. He knew the king, in his paranoia, would not forgive him. He knew that his act of mercy would be interpreted as a betrayal, and that he, the king's shadow, would become the hunted. But for the first time in a long time, Benaiah felt no fear. He felt a deep peace, a certainty. that his soul was on the right path. He was no longer running, he was walking toward his true journey. He, the man who killed in the name of loyalty, was now willing to die in the name of his own redemption. Benaiah's shield had broken, but in its fragility he had finally become a man. He felt the weight of the sword, but this time the weight was of purpose, not of duty. What followed was a night of reflection and silence, a silence that, for the first time, was not filled with the absence of sound, but with the presence of a new and profound peace. Benaiah took shelter in an abandoned ruin on the outskirts of the city, a place that time had forgotten, but that he knew from his hunting and reconnaissance missions. He lit a small fire, more to see the dancing flames than to warm himself. The heat, the smell of smoke, everything seemed more real, more palpable. His mind, once a battlefield of orders and duties, was now a calm lake. He thought of everything he had done, the faces he had taken, and for the first time he did not feel the emptiness of obedience, but the weight of responsibility. Every soul, every life was a story, and he, Benaiah, had been the executioner who ended those stories. The pain was immense, but it was a necessary pain, the pain of awakening. He felt like a man who had spent his entire life sleeping and who suddenly woke up to the terror and beauty of reality. The cold night wind made him shiver, but he did not feel cold. He felt life, the flow of energy that connected him to the world he, in his blindness, had ignored. The news of his betrayal, he knew, would fly faster than the wind. The king, in his paranoia and pride, would not tolerate disobedience. Benaiah, the executioner, would now be the traitor, the #1 enemy of the throne. But the irony did not faze him. He was no longer the man who feared death, but the man who feared himself. And now that he had confronted himself, there was nothing left to fear. He knew the king's guards would come. The men who called him a brother-in-arms would now hunt him like an animal. But he was ready, not for battle, but for redemption. He would not fight to survive, but to defend his new truth. He got up. The sword at his waist seemed lighter. He would not fight to live, but to have a death with honor, something he had sacrificed a long time ago. He was a free man. His prison was his mind, and he had freed himself. Benaiah's shield had broken, but in its fragility, it became a new armor, forged in compassion and truth. He knew his path would be difficult, but he was finally walking in the right direction. The next morning came with a pale, cloudless sky, the sun rising like an eye of fire over the mountains of Judah. The light revealed the dust and abandonment of the ruins where Benaiah had spent the night, a mirror for his own soul, desolate and in search of reconstruction. He was no longer hungry for glory, but for a redemption he knew was almost impossible. The sound of the wind, which was once a melody of freedom, now seemed to carry the echo of heavy footsteps. He knew they would come in search of him. The king, in his wounded vanity, would not allow his shadow to become a beacon of rebellion. The hunt would begin, and Benaiah, the most feared hunter in the kingdom, would become the hunted. But there was no fear in his heart. His new freedom was a shield stronger than any metal. He would not fight to survive, but to die as a man and not as a tool. He had sacrificed his soul once, and he would not do it again. He was ready for battle, but his victory would not be in the death of his enemies, but in his own death, a death that would make him finally a man of honor. He felt the weight of the sword, But this time, the weight was of purpose, not of duty. He was no longer the warrior who killed for a king, but a man who fought for his own soul. The sight of the king's horsemen approaching was like a scene from a bad dream, but Benaiah was wide awake. He saw the dust they kicked up in the distance, a brown cloud that moved with the speed of a predator. They were his former companions, the men he had trained and fought alongside. Their leader, a young man with a fierce gaze, was someone Benaiah considered a son. The irony was bitter, but it did not weaken him. He felt at peace. He would not raise his sword against them, would not fight with the intention of killing. He would fight to defend himself, to show them that true strength does not lie in blind obedience, but in the courage to follow one's own conscience. The wind, which was once the world's lament, now seemed to whisper his name. It was a new day, and he was a new man. The hunt had begun, but his race was not one of flight, but of freedom. He was no longer a prisoner of blind loyalty, but a free man, ready to face his destiny with his head held high. Benaiah's shield had broken, but in its fragility, it became a new armor, forged in compassion and truth. He knew his path would be difficult, but he was finally walking in the right direction. Benaiah, seeing his former comrades approaching, did not seek a hiding place, nor did he prepare an ambush. He stood on an elevated plateau where the wind stirred the folds of his tunic, making him look like a living statue. He carried no shield, only his sword in his hand, but not in a position to attack. It was a silent invitation, a request for the fight to be fair, man to man, without the tricks of an assassin. His posture was that of a man at peace, not of a fugitive. He saw the face of each of them, the looks of confusion, and in some, of betrayal. They did not understand. How could the executioner, the king's arm, have turned against the crown itself? They saw only the surface, the breaking of an oath. But Benaiah felt the depth, the redemption of a soul. He knew they would fight with fury, with the fury of the blind loyalty that he for so long had also possessed. But his fight would be different. It would be the fight of a man who knew what he was defending, his own soul, his own humanity. The dust settled, and the leader of the group, the young man he had trained, stepped forward. His eyes, once full of admiration, were now full of disappointment. "Why, Benaiah?" he asked, and his voice was a mixture of sadness and anger. "What did the king do to you?" Benaiah just smiled, a sad but genuine smile. "He freed me," he replied, and the words were a mystery to the young man. How could betrayal be freedom? Benaiah saw in the boy's eyes the same blindness he had carried for years. He was Benaiah's mirror, what he had become, and the sight was painful. The young man raised his sword, the blade glinting in the sun. "I have no choice. I will obey the king's order." Benaiah nodded. He understood. And because he understood, he felt no anger, but pity. His fight was not against them, but against the system that turned them into soulless machines. He raised his sword, not to attack, but to defend, to show them that the true battle was not in the flesh, but in the soul. And his soul, he knew, had already won. His death, he knew, would be his greatest victory. His fight would not be for triumph, but for honor, an honor he had sacrificed a long time ago. The battle that followed was not like the others Benaiah had fought. There was no fury in his blows, nor the bloodlust that had moved him for years. His movements were precise, defensive, the dance of a man who refused to kill. He dodged swords with a grace his former companions had never seen, and he disarmed them with a single touch, a blow to the wrist that took the blade from the opponent's hand. He was not a warrior, but an artist of defense, and his art was the preservation of life. His companions, trained to kill, were confused. This was not the Benaiah they knew, the man of few words and deadly blows. It was like fighting a ghost, a reflection of who he was, but who was now filled with a light. They could not understand. Their frustration grew with every failed blow, and anger mixed with fear. What was this strength that made him invincible? It was not the strength of a man, but the strength of a conviction. His soul, now free, was his true shield. The young man, the leader of the hunt, was the most desperate. He fought with the fury of one who needs to prove himself, of one who needs to show that loyalty is more important than conscience. He attacked Benaiah with a series of quick and furious blows, but each of them was dodged with frightening ease. Benaiah was not fighting him, but guiding him, teaching him with every movement that strength without purpose is just violence. He saw the pain in the young man's eyes, the pain of a man who is about to break. And Benaiah did not want him to break, he wanted him to become whole. In a quick, fluid movement, Benaiah disarmed the young man, and instead of using his sword, he placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. The king doesn't see you. He just uses you, he whispered, and the voice was as soft as a feather, but the weight of those words was stronger than any blow. The young man, in shock, looked at his empty hand and then at Benaiah's eyes. He saw the man, not the legend, and the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. Benaiah had sacrificed his life to save his soul, and the young man, in his blind loyalty, was about to sacrifice his in the name of a man who did not care. The king's sword, which they used, was now a burden. The scene became a surreal painting amid the arid landscape. Benaiah, the legendary warrior, standing, unharmed, while his pursuers, the best soldiers in the kingdom, were disarmed and perplexed. The one who came to hunt had become the master, not through violence, but through a compassion they could not understand. The young man, still with a confused look, picked up his sword, but instead of attacking, he lowered it. "I can't," he whispered, and the voice was that of a man who was crumbling, not in defeat but in revelation. He had seen the truth. The loyalty he so cherished, the foundation of his existence, was, in fact, a prison. Benaiah had not hurt them, but he had broken them in a deeper way, breaking the veil of lies that kept them blind. He was not a traitor, he was a beacon, a mirror that reflected the truth they refused to see. And the truth was that loyalty to a man without honor is a dishonor. It was a lesson they, the warriors, would never forget. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind, which now seemed to sing a new melody. Benaiah turned and began to walk, without looking back. He didn't need to. He knew that the seed of doubt had been planted. He knew that the young man, and perhaps the others, would never see the world the same way again. He had not defeated them with the sword, but with his own soul. His victory was not in battle, but in his own redemption. He walked, his footprints in the sand marking the beginning of a new journey. He was no longer the executioner, the king's arm. He was just Benaiah, a man in search of his own destiny. The weight of the sword at his waist was now that of a promise a promise that he would never again bend, that he would never again sacrifice his soul for a man who did not deserve it. His fall, his betrayal, was in fact his greatest act of honor. He had freed himself, and his freedom was a testimony to all who followed him. His fall was his triumph. He was not a hero, but a man, and his humanity was his greatest strength. Benaiah's walk took him to the desert, no man's land, where the only law was that of the sun and the wind. He, who had spent his life amid fortresses and conspiracies, felt a strange and profound peace in that vast and empty place. The sand dunes stretched to the horizon, a landscape that seemed to move and breathe, just like his own soul, which was in constant transformation. He was no longer running, but exploring the confines of his own conscience, in search of answers to the questions he had avoided his entire life. What was a man? What was honor? And what was freedom? The weight of the sword, once a burden, was now a reminder of his new mission. He was no longer an assassin, but a protector, not of a king, but of his own soul. He felt light, as if the desert, in its vastness, had absorbed the weight of his guilt, leaving him free to reconnect with who he really was. He felt like a man who was returning home, not to a physical place, but to the place within himself that he had abandoned a long time ago. In the middle of the desert, night came with a coldness that made him tremble. But the cold was not of the body, but of the soul. He sat around a small campfire, looking at the stars that looked like a veil of diamonds over the darkness. They were the same stars he had seen from his house window in his youth, and the sight brought him back to a time of innocence, to a time when his soul was not a scar. He felt the pain of loss, the loss of his innocence, but he also felt the promise of a new beginning. He was no longer the young man who wanted to serve a king, but a man who wanted to serve something greater. His betrayal, he realized now, was his greatest act of faith. He had broken his oath to a man, to make an oath to himself and his soul. He was a man who no longer had a master, but who was the master of his own destiny. Benaiah's shield had broken, but in its fragility, it became a new armor, forged in compassion and truth. He knew his path would be difficult, but he was finally walking in the right direction. The desert, which seemed empty, revealed its secrets to Benaiah. He learned to read the stars, to find water where there seemed to be none, to recognize the path not by what he saw, but by what he felt. With every step, he felt more connected to the earth, to the wind, to the silence. His sword, which was once a tool of death, became a tool of survival, used to cut a path through the bushes, to dig holes to protect himself from the sun. He was no longer an assassin, but a man in communion with nature. His soul, which was once a battlefield, was now a garden of peace, where compassion and truth flourished. He found a cave, a cool, dark place, and decided to take shelter there. The cave was a refuge, not just from the sun, but from his own past. There he could sit and meditate, reflecting on his life, on his choices, and on the future he was building, a future that was not of a warrior, but of a man. In the back of the cave, he found a small pool of water, clean and crystal clear. He knelt and looked at his reflection. It was not the face of Benaiah, the executioner, the man of few words and empty gaze. It was the face of a man with eyes full of a light he had never seen before. His beard was longer, his hair more disheveled, but in his eyes he saw his own soul, a soul he had sacrificed and which, now, was back home. He dipped his hands in the cold water and washed them. He was not just washing away sweat and dust, but washing the blood from his hands, the blood of the lives he had taken. The ritual was simple, but the meaning was profound. It was his purification, his redemption, his rebirth. He got up, feeling lighter than ever. His sword, which was once a burden, was now a symbol of his new life. He was no longer the warrior who killed for a king, but a man who fought for his own soul. He had freed himself, and his freedom was a testimony to all who followed him. His fall was his triumph. He was not a hero, but a man, and his humanity was his greatest strength. Time in the cave passed differently. It was no longer measured by the sun or the moon, but by the beats of Benaiah's heart, which now pulsed at a slower and more serene rhythm. He spent his days in meditation, in silence, seeking a peace he did not know was possible. His sword, which he kept with reverence, was now an object of contemplation, not of violence. He looked at it, and he did not see the blood it had shed, but the promise of a new beginning, the promise of a life he was about to build. His soul, which was once an open wound, was now in the process of healing. He felt like a man who was being rebuilt, piece by something he could not name, but which he felt in every cell of his body. It was his humanity, his soul, that was coming back home after a long and painful exile. The night he decided to leave, the moon was full and bright, illuminating the desert with a magical silvery light. He was no longer running. He was walking toward his destiny, toward his future. He knew the world outside was still the same, full of violence and darkness, but he was no longer the same. He was a free man, a man who would not bend, a man who was not afraid. He turned and looked at the cave, his refuge, and felt a profound gratitude. That place was not just a cave, but his sanctuary, the place where his soul had healed. And from that moment on, he knew he would no longer be the king's arm, but the guardian of his own soul. His fall, his betrayal, was in fact his greatest act of honor. He had freed himself, and his freedom was a testimony to all who followed him. His fall was his triumph. He was not a hero, but a man, and his humanity was his greatest strength. Benaiah emerged from the desert, not as the warrior who was lost, but as the man who was found. He headed south toward a small, fishing village on the edge of the Great Sea, a quiet, isolated place where news of the world seemed to arrive with the slowness of the tide. He no longer wore his armor, nor did he visibly carry his sword. He was just a simple man, with skin tanned by the sun and eyes that held the wisdom of one who had seen darkness and found the light. He worked as a fisherman, his skilled hands, which once wielded the sword with perfection, now dedicated to mending nets and guiding the boat through the calm waters. He did not talk about his past, and his inner peace was so palpable that no one in the village questioned his origin. He was known as the man of the sea, a stranger who seemed to have the calm and depth of the ocean. He lived a simple life, and in his simplicity he found true happiness. He did not need riches or power or recognition. He had enough, and enough was his own soul. The story of Benaiah, the king's executioner who disappeared, became a whispered legend throughout the land. No one knew what had happened to him, and the king, in his fury and paranoia, tried for years to find him, but without success. The legend said that he had died, that his soul had been consumed by the darkness he had served. But the truth that Benaiah knew, was that he had not died. He had been reborn. His fall was not his ruin, but his liberation. His shield had broken, but in its fragility it became a new armor, forged in compassion and truth. He was not a hero, but a man. And his humanity was his greatest strength. He, the man who killed in the name of loyalty, now lived in peace, a guardian of his own soul, a man who, in his fall, found his triumph.